I publish a magazine called Stir, which you can see over on the table there. We're doing them at half price today, so pick up a copy. But it's basically a quarterly magazine which looks at new economic ideas and tools. We publish a lot of original art and kind of takes a global perspective on the commons, on the cooperative movement, and lots of stuff which is happening at the community level around social change. So I just thought I'd warm up the day with a kind of look at our new issue. So we published that a few weeks ago. That's our summer issue, just to kind of like pick up on some ideas. I'm not going to go too deep, but some of the speakers that we have today are going to kind of deepen and develop those ideas. So the lead article that we published in this issue was called Not Alone, and it was based on a report by Co-ops UK, and the research associate is a guy called Pat Colonies, who's been working in the UK for the last few decades. He's a Californian, and he's been really pushing a kind of solidarity economy agenda and co-ops through his work. And his article starts about talking about the gig economy, or on-demand economy. Are people familiar with that term? If you're not familiar with that term, then you might know it inaccurately as the sharing economy. And some of the kind of features and characteristics of this kind of economy are labour casualisation, zero-hour contracts, people are contractors rather than employees, even though they act de facto as employees, which means that they have no employment rights, no access to insurance, and essentially they're self-employed even though technically they're acting as employees for these large companies. So why care about self-employed or freelance? Well, there's 4.6 million freelancers in the UK now. That makes up something like 15% of the workforce. 15% might not sound a lot, but since 2008, since the financial crisis, self-employment has made up 2/3 of all new jobs generated. And that's going to continue. So the RSA, the Royal Society of Arts, have predicted that by 2018, just 2 years away, that there's going to be more people working as self-employed freelancers than working in public sector jobs. So what we're seeing is a huge shift in the economy here, and the ways that we organise as workers is also going to have to change with this shift. This kind of shift in the economy has been called the Uberisation of the economy. So many people are familiar with the non-taxi firm Uber, i.e. they're not a taxi firm. They describe themselves as simply connecting drivers with passengers. So they use a digital online platform which facilitates that. So they own no cars, they have no employees, they just loosely contract drivers who pay for their own cars, take out their own loans to buy those cars, and connect them with passengers. And I was looking at a Financial Times article just yesterday, and even they refer to this change in the economy as neo-serfdom. That's in the Financial Times. And lots of people have been talking about, I interviewed Nathan Schneider in here, who's an American journalist. He talks about this as feudalism. And there's a really interesting review in the London Review of Books by someone called Owen Haverley. He's an academic based in London. Politically, you'd probably call him a social democrat, quite statist. But he kind of calls into criticism how vague the term post-capitalism is. Because he says if you look at pre-capitalism, what's to suggest that post-capitalism is going to be any better? Slavery, serfdom, feudalism, and so on. So then the focus of the report moves on to some of the alternatives, because that's the work that Pat does. There's a freelance union in New York City. It's actually 20 years old now, but they have 280,000 members. And they describe themselves as organising the unaffiliated. So the kind of vulnerability of self-employed workers who just work individually for large companies, they give a lot of protection and provision for these workers as members of that union, and essentially it's really a mutual. And at the moment they're pushing through an act called Freelance Isn't Free. In the UK, we have freelance co-ops and consortium co-ops. So a freelance co-op can use the LLP, the Limited Liability Partnership model, or the consortium co-op model. And basically what they are, I mean, one example would be Chapel Street Studios, which is based in Leeds. They're a group of creative entrepreneurs. And so rather than working individually and pitching for contracts individually, they work together. So they're copywriters, graphic designers, illustrators, and so they work together, so they're not alone. They're able to bid for larger contracts than they could do individually. And they can share back office facilities, which when you work within a large company, you don't have to worry about the large burden of overheads, which are very costly for individual self-employed workers. Another really interesting model is the union co-op model. This was launched in 2012, and it was a collaboration between Mondragon, which is the largest cooperative in the world in North Spain in the Basque, and the United Steelworkers Union, which is the largest membership union in the United States. And the idea behind this collaboration was it wanted to combine the worker control and workplace democracy that you get within cooperatives with the organisational strengths that you get from the trade unions. So it's bringing those two things together, two really powerful features into one model. If you are self-employed, a really interesting model to look up is bread funds. So bread funds were launched in Holland in 2006, and there's something like 190 bread funds now in operation. Radical Roots, who many of you may know as a kind of radical cooperative and co-housing group in the UK, they've just funded 2 pilots. So there's 2 active pilots in Nottingham and London. And essentially a bread fund is a mutual sick pot. It's for long-term sickness, so it's not for you if you've got a cold and off for a few days. It's more, the sick pot starts paying after you've been out of work for 30 days or more. So it gives security in a very kind of precarious freelance industry. Interestingly, they cap membership at around 50 or 60 members. And the reason they do this is so that they found that if they exceed that kind of number within the bread fund, that people start to exploit it, you get free riders, and you lose the accountability which exists within smaller groups. So essentially, you know, it's kind of really reviving the kind of probably 19th, 18th century friendly society in some ways. Pat ends the report by going, you know, talking about the challenge that we're facing with a shift in the economy, this Uberization of the economy, and he calls all of these responses that I've just talked about as solidarity economy strategies, organising the unaffiliated. And there's a big call out and the work that he's doing and that we're going to be doing in London in October around bringing together what he calls the cousins of the labour movement, bringing cooperatives and trade unions together, this kind of fractured labour movement which over the last couple of centuries hasn't really been working together. Another fascinating article that we published is by Australian academic Jose Ramos, and he introduces this really interesting concept of used futures. And by that he means it's an idea or an image which somebody's created in another context, but to which we hold on to unconsciously. We kind of see this as the, you know, the way that the future's going to happen. And obviously he starts with artificial intelligence and robotics. And you know, he makes a really important point that technology will play a more significant role in the future of work and in the future of our lives. But what he's against is this kind of techno-deterministic vision which says that everything is going to be technology-led. He also looks at the entrepreneurial revolution, and the idea here was that enterprise by enterprise, startup by startup, the world is going to change purely through enterprise. And again, he recognises that enterprise, social enterprise, co-ops and a fair market are really, really valuable parts and really important ingredients, but by themselves they're only part of the, you know, the kind of the new future that we actually need. And then he kind of looks at some alternatives. One really interesting alternative is the Chamber of the Commons. So I'm sure everybody's familiar with the idea of the Chambers of Commerce. So locally, regionally, nationally, you have these organisations which represent the interests of member businesses. And in the same way, a Chambers of Commerce would represent the interests of pro-commons, pro-social businesses in a very organised way, which means that we can do stuff like advocacy, get policy passed, have acts, and all that kind of infrastructure which needs to support the new economy. Something I'll touch on again is platform co-ops. So more and more of our economy is going digital, more and more of our services and goods are accessed via digital platforms. And at the moment we have something called platform capitalism. Again, this goes back to the neo-serfdom, the feudalism that we talked about earlier, from Airbnb, from Uber and Amazon and those kind of organisations. So the idea here is that we need to have a cooperative internet. We need to have an internet which is worker-owned and worker-controlled. And where value is produced, that value needs to be distributed to workers as opposed to investors. So the kind of conclusion of this article is that automation and technology are really, really important, but that they need to be at the service of social and ecological commons. And this touches on a quote that we got. So we asked 3 different people from around the world what they thought the future of work would be. And Bronwyn Morgan, who's worked with us before, she co-edited our issue on law and social change. She does a lot around kind of like social enterprise and law. When I asked her what the future of work was, she said, the dissolving line between work and home that technology enables is either the most menacing or the most promising trend shaping the future of work. Its promise depends on harnessing it to a collective politics. If not, the 1% will monetize our last corners of intimacy. Which kind of leads on to my interview with Nathan Schneider. So last November in 2015, the first Platform Co-op event was held in New York. There's going to be another one this November. And again, this is going back to the fact that our economy is shifting into a digital economy and lots of people are accessing their goods and services via online platforms. So this shift is from fixed jobs, kind of the post-war kind of social democracy that we had and state benefits, into a much more precarious work landscape. What Platform Co-ops are doing is they're saying that organisational governance and organisational ownership are really, really important. Because we've got workers working for these large organisations who are just having all of the value and all of their time extracted and getting very, very little in return. So this event was, I think I mentioned it earlier, but it was this coming out party for the cooperative internet. So some examples of Platform Co-ops would be Fairmondo. Fairmondo is an online marketplace, much like Amazon. It started in Germany, and the exception is that Fairmondo is owned by the vendors, the sellers on the site, and by its users, by the buyers. So it's a multi-stakeholder cooperative. And another really good example is Stocksy. Stocksy is a US-based stock photo platform, with the exception that it's owned by the photographers and the staff. So photographers receive 50% of the sale, and then they get a dividend. And I think the figures for last year suggested that of a turnover of about 7.8 million, 4.6 million of that was paid in royalties to the photographers, and then a £200,000 dividend was also paid.
What's that called?
What's also great about the new economy and the future of work, with the example of Fairmondo, is that they've open sourced their code base. So regulating all of these sites, the online infrastructure of these sites, the kind of the code which people use, they've said to a UK company who were trying to start something called Ethical Bay until they got into trouble with eBay, and then figured that they would have to start a whole new they'd have to start a whole new company and do all of the code work again. They talked to Fairmondo and they've now open sourced that. So that code base is being used, and we now have Fairmondo UK. That's definitely worth checking out. And it's, again, this idea of starting federations and not monopolies. So Fairmondo is a German marketplace. They're not interested in monopolising other markets, UK markets, Chinese markets. They're up for federating and sharing their code base so that local and regional groups can then use that basis to launch their own businesses. I guess one thing, I've probably only got a few minutes left now, one thing to finish on, because I've been talking about business and enterprise a lot, is mutual aid networks. So mutual aid networks are obviously a very, very old tradition, but they've been formalised by Stephanie Rearick, who's based in Madison in the United States. She started a time bank in Madison, I think, in the early 2000s. And when she started the time bank, she thought, this is going to be it. This is going to fix all of our problems, all of our social, environmental problems. And she realised that, of course, it didn't. So she started looking around this idea of a network of networks. And she came up with the idea of formalising mutual aid networks. And they have 9 pilots, 8 of those are in the US, and we have 1 in the UK at the moment, up in Hull. And I think she's in talks with people in Totnes about a mutual aid network there. And again, the idea behind this, and I guess you could call it a real sharing economy. So I talked about the fact that we've got this co-optation of the so-called sharing economy, which is really an Uberization. But there is a real sharing economy, which is about community resourcing. It's about the original idea that we could actually share community resources, assets, and skills, but do it in a non-monetized way. So this is an example of a commons, which exists outside of monetary exchange. So it's not selling spare capacity to a stranger. It's about using it as a community resource to support people. And one of the really interesting ideas that they've developed is the idea of a basic human livelihood. So basic income is obviously becoming very popular, but their kind of argument is that it's going to take quite a while for political favour to shift. So in Switzerland we saw 72% vote against basic income introduction in the referendum. And obviously, probably in the UK, we'd probably start from an even worse position than that. And their idea of a basic human livelihood is how you can create these huge community resources through a mutual aid network. So people don't have to, work at corporate jobs, and we create a much stronger kind of social network. So I think I'm kind of running out of time, and we're going to move into some local economy stuff. But should we open it to the floor for a few minutes?
Are there any questions from anyone?
What's the mutual aid network called?
It's called Mutual Aid Network. Okay. They describe themselves as the MAN for short. But it's all available online.
Thanks.
And they'd be interested in hearing from people from different towns who who may be interested in setting up a pilot. See if it could work there.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I'm curious to understand, do you see the Uberization or the Airbnb model as positive?
As positive?
I mean, I understand that a lot of, as I read about Uber, a lot of the money they get is by selling the data of their users. So they make money by the whole business model, but a lot of money also comes from just giving that data away.
Yeah.
So that the marketing, same with Facebook, right? You get the exact marketing because they find everything you're doing there with the data, and with Uber is similar. So, do you see that?
No, I didn't see it positive at all.
No.
I mean, but freelancing can be positive in terms of cooperative ownership and governance. For example, in the US in 1900, there were 3 times as many freelancers, or let's say self-employed, as there are today in the US. And the reason for that was because there were lots of artisans, there were lots of craftspeople, and there were lots of people doing work outside of large companies. So, and of course the idea of the freelance cooperative is that you bring freelancers together so that they actually work together rather than pitching individually or working alone. Uber's model is just one of complete extraction. They've got into so much trouble. I mean, they set up a relationship with Santander USA and GM Motors, and they were getting drivers to self-finance their own cars via loans through Santander. And this was essentially another subprime crisis in the making. And I think their relationship with Santander has ceased because they came under so much pressure. These drivers can be sacked, just like that. There's barely any recourse, and it's extremely precarious.
Same with Airbnb. You have local hostels, local bed and breakfast, and these people come and all the money goes to San Francisco.
Yeah.
Okay, I think Isabel had a question, and then Mike.
Yeah, Jonny, what you've been describing is like many different examples of the new emerging. Can you see any space in which they're connecting up to create a more connected up story?
Yeah, I guess, using expressions like the new economy or the next economy, or something that me and Jay have kind of are going to be working around a bit later this year is the solidarity economy. And I think that's very much about, networks of networks. How do we bring together and collect lots of these ideas and tools, which at the moment might be a bit kind of here, there and everywhere, kind of bring them together so that they're available and accessible to communities. And I think that's a really, really crucial part. I guess the reason we're doing that now is because we've had, a decade or more of innovation. And I think that's really necessary that people have been focusing on these models and developing them and getting them to that stage, and everyone wants to hurry them to the stage, rush them to the stage of, you know, this works, that works. But I think showing their viability, you know, testing them, allowing communities to show that they actually work, and then going out, I think that's, yeah, it's definitely the stage we're at. And I think solidarity economics and the transition network are definitely part of those movements to bring it to more people.
Yeah, thank you.
Right?
Yeah, I just have a question around, so like freelancers are obviously people who are already skilled within some sort of form of work, and then there's a whole generation now of people who are just out of work, because we don't have that manufacturing base anymore, so people who would have gone into like maybe more unskilled jobs initially and then were trained up, that doesn't happen. And then so I can remember like working in unemployed centres in the 90s, and we'd have stuff like claimants unions and things like that. And I just wonder, like, what's the interaction between, you know, the groups of, there's huge groups of people now who are out of work, and there's also going to be, with the more, the more that technology can provide jobs. I was just in Morrison's for my sins before I came here, and I noticed that there's more and more automation within these places now, and less staff. So we're going to have this huge pool of surplus labour, and it's just, how does that then begin to interact with some of these models? I mean, like, I suppose co-ops could be training people up to be involved with that sort of thing. I just wondered if there was any.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely work to be done on kind of bringing in people from communities which have been part of kind of historical labour, which is just irrelevant because the economy has moved on. Old Gen, who are based in London, we've got Henry Naylor-Stead here this afternoon. They're an extremely inspiring organisation, and they work with 18 to 35-year-olds. They particularly work with university graduates who are going into a really poor, precarious job market, which is full of unpaid internships. And again, the idea is, it's not competition, it's cooperation. Getting people together to work together. But again, people leaving as graduates with degrees are different from people. I'm just about to start working on a project called Building Better Opportunities, which is an £8 million lottery-funded project, which is working specifically with unemployed people. So you have to be technically unemployed. And what's really positive about this is that they're trying to shift from employment to enterprise. So rather than the traditional approach of go get a job, which doesn't exist or it's meaningless and unsatisfying, it's how can we get people together to start enterprises together. So there needs to be more and more of that kind of work, to work with people who are unemployed and might not have fantastic skill sets.